There are records buried deep in the Greene County Courthouse in Alabama, records so disturbing that for nearly a century, no one dared open the drawers that held them. The building itself still stands, a red brick relic with sun-bleached columns, its foundation warped by humidity and time. Beneath the floorboards, beneath decades of routine filings and tax deeds, lay the story of one family whose name still stains the soil they once owned. The Caldwells. The ledgers that told their story were found by accident during a renovation in the 1980s. Each one was bound in cracked leather, the pages brittle but legible, the ink faded to the color of dried blood. The first entry began in 1783, the last in 1880. Every page was neat, numbered, and signed, like someone was preparing them for judgment. But these were not business logs. They were not crop reports. At the top of every page, written in that same elegant script, were two words that silenced the archivists who found them: breeding ledger. Those two words changed everything we thought we knew about Southern slavery. For 100 years, the Caldwell plantations operated across 3 states, Virginia, Alabama, and Mississippi, creating what historians would later call a human production network. What the Caldwells built was not just a plantation empire, but a dynasty of birth, blood, and ownership, a system so meticulously documented that every life was a sign of value before it ever drew breath. In the official histories, the Caldwells were celebrated as patriots and philanthropists, founders of churches, donors to schools, patrons of the arts. But in these ledgers, their virtue dissolved into arithmetic. The records listed names, ages, conception dates, and expected yields. The word yield appears more than any other. There were entries like, Lydia, age 20, delivered male child, healthy, value $275. And another, written in the margin by a different hand, mother to be reassigned after recovery. No commentary, no remorse, only the rhythm of commerce. By the time the final page was written, the Caldwells had recorded over 800 births, 800 human beings conceived, cataloged, and sold, each one marked as proof of success. The handwriting changes over the decades, but the logic never does. It's precise, cold, and familiar. The courthouse workers who stumbled across these ledgers said the air in that basement felt wrong, heavy, as if the building itself was aware of what it had been keeping silent. One man later admitted he couldn't finish reading even a single page. He said it wasn't the words that haunted him, it was how clean they were, because evil, when organized enough, doesn't scream. It whispers through paperwork. Before we move further into this story, take a moment to think about where you're hearing it from. Somewhere near you, there's a courthouse just like this one, a building that's seen too much and remembers too well. In the spring of 1987, Greene County's courthouse was scheduled for renovation. The building had been standing since 1859, a red brick monument to law, justice, and selective memory. Beneath its paint and plaster, time had layered itself like sediment. Reconstruction-era contracts, Depression-era deeds, forgotten tax receipts. No one expected history to be waiting under the floor. It was a Monday when a crew from Tuscaloosa began replacing rotted boards in the records room. Around mid-morning, one of the workers struck metal with his crowbar. The sound rang out through the room, a hollow, buried echo. Beneath a layer of warped planks, they uncovered a steel chest, corroded by time but still sealed tight. Stamped into its lid were the faint letters, Property of C. Caldwell, 1852. The county clerk, uncertain what to do, called in a preservation officer from the University of Alabama. Together, they pried open the chest. The first thing they noticed was a smell, mold, iron, and something else. Something dry and sweet, like old ink mixed with decay. Inside lay 22 bound ledgers, wrapped in burlap and tied with twine. The titles were written in a fading, ornate script: birth records, nursery accounts, annual reports, Caldwell lineage. At first, they assumed the books contained standard estate inventories. Family ledgers were common among old plantations. But within minutes of opening the first volume, the tone of the room changed. The handwriting was neat, almost beautiful. The content was monstrous. Each page listed names, first names only, followed by words like value, yield, parent rotation, and viability. The first person to read more than a few lines was Dr. Robert Hastings, a historian who specialized in antebellum economics. His notes, later archived under seal, describe what he saw as an organized breeding program spanning 4 generations. The ledgers detail births between 1783 and 1880, all conducted within Caldwell properties across Virginia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Each child born to an enslaved mother was assigned a code, B1, B2, B3, and value based on line potential. Hastings' report was clinical, but his diary, found years later, shows what that discovery did to him. One entry reads, "It's not the cruelty that terrifies me, it's the system." They weren't improvising. They were calculating. The county commission, however, saw only one thing, a problem. The Caldwells were still a powerful name in Alabama politics, their descendants holding positions in banking, law, and local government. The revelation of a century-long breeding operation would ruin the town's image and reopen wounds people had spent generations pretending to heal. Within weeks, the courthouse staff were ordered to seal the chest in the basement. Officially, it was labeled estate materials, under review. Unofficially, it became taboo. County employees who mentioned it were told to leave the dead alone. The silence held for 8 years, until a graduate student named Evelyn Turner stumbled upon a reference to Caldwell birth records in an outdated microfilm index. She requested access and was handed a single ledger, the least disturbing of the set. It contained 187 entries. Each one noted a mother's first name, the father's assigned number, and the phrase child retained. Turner realized what she was reading almost immediately. She began cross-referencing census data, wills, and property records. The deeper she dug, the clearer the pattern became. The Caldwells hadn't just bred enslaved people for labor, they had bred them for sale. Her research should have changed American history. Instead, it nearly ended her career. When Turner presented her findings at a university symposium in 1991, a faculty donor, himself a Caldwell descendant, stood up and called it a fabrication meant to humiliate Southern families. Within a month, her department cut funding. Her paper, The Caldwell System, an economic study in human reproduction, was quietly removed from the university's archives. Still, copies survived. Turner kept one. Another was leaked to a journalist in 1993, who published a short article titled The Caldwell Papers, A Town's Hidden Sin. It was pulled within days after legal threats. The paper's editor later confessed that he received anonymous calls warning him to let sleeping ghosts lie. Hastings died in 1994, never publishing his notes. Turner disappeared from public life. The ledgers were sealed again, this time inside the Alabama Department of Archives under restricted collection. But even silence leaves a record. A janitor who worked in that building during the 2000s recalled hearing voices in the basement late at night, officials reading the ledgers in private, arguing in hushed tones. He said it wasn't the words that frightened him. It was the way they kept turning the pages long after they had gone silent. In 2010, when the state began digitizing its archives, the Caldwell materials were listed simply as Estate Holdings Confidential. The metadata revealed one chilling summary line in the archive log. 22 volumes, 97 years, 814 recorded births. That number is now all that remains visible to the public. The Caldwell story begins in the rolling hills of Albemarle County, Virginia, where tobacco grew thick in the clay and the air smelled of iron and sweat. Their first plantation stood 5 miles outside Charlottesville, built in 1779 by Thomas Caldwell I, a Revolutionary War veteran who used his military grant to buy land and people. He was not the largest planter in the region, nor the most brutal, but he was organized, devout, and convinced that God had appointed him to manage the souls placed under his care. The homestead still stands, or what's left of it. Locals call it the Hollow, a 2-story brick house with whitewashed walls, its chimneys cracked and leaning. Behind it lies a cluster of ruins. Stone foundations of cabins long collapsed, a root cellar overtaken by vines, and the ghost of a well that once fed a community that never chose to be there. This was where the first experiments began. Virginia's economy was already changing in those years. Tobacco fields were dying. Planters faced debt drought, and declining yields. The importation of enslaved people from Africa was being restricted. The Caldwells, like many others, began to see their human property not as workers to be bought and sold, but as resources to be grown. What began as convenience, enslaved families expanding naturally, became policy. By 1808, the Caldwells had migrated southward, seeking new land and new opportunities. They settled next in Greene County, Alabama, where cotton replaced tobacco and the promise of wealth hung heavy in the air. The Alabama estate, later called Briar Hollow, covered more than 1,200 acres bordered by the Black Warrior River. The soil was rich, the laws lenient, and the social order firm. No one asked questions about how a man doubled his labor force between seasons. Neighbors described Thomas Caldwell, too, the founder's son, as a gentleman of Christian character. He donated land for the local chapel, funded a small school for white children, and served as a church elder. In public, he embodied decency. In private, he kept a second set of books locked in his study. Each morning after prayer, he would sit at his desk with the window open, the hymns from the chapel faint in the distance, and record the night's bursts from the nursery. The world around him rewarded that hypocrisy. The county's ministers preached about duty and divine order. Judges socialized at his home. Legislators praised his innovations in labor management. The plantation was lauded as one of the most efficient in Alabama. Travelers wrote about its beauty, the magnolia-lined paths, the laughter of children, the warmth of the hospitality. None of them asked why those children never seemed to age past 12 before disappearing from view. Farther west, along the Mississippi border, the Caldwells established a third estate called Riverbend. Here the land met water, and boats carried cotton bales downstream toward New Orleans. Riverbend became the center of the Caldwell enterprise after 1835, a plantation designed not for growth of crops, but of people. Its layout was mathematical. Main house at the top of a hill, workers' cabins below, and at the far edge, behind rows of oaks, a fenced cluster of low structures the Caldwells referred to simply as the nursery. The nursery appeared on every estate blueprint. It was described in account books and insurance filings. It was never mentioned in church records, in letters to friends, or in the public deeds. It existed in silence. Maps from the 1850s show a ring of smaller farms surrounding each Caldwell property. Most were owned by families connected by blood or marriage, the Rutledges, McHenrys, and Burns. They formed a quiet alliance, trading not just crops, but people. The same surnames appear across sales ledgers from Virginia, Alabama, and Mississippi, suggesting an unspoken network of breeding corridors. To outsiders, these were respectable Christian landowners. To one another, they were business partners in an industry so grotesque it had no name. The geography of their empire wasn't random. It was strategic. Each property sat near a county seat with a courthouse and church, institutions that legitimized ownership and moralized order. Their profits depended on proximity to law and faith. The courthouse recorded births as property increases. The church baptized the same infants without asking who their fathers were. In this geography, sin became invisible because it had been built into the landscape. Even nature seemed to conspire with them. The Alabama air was thick with heat, the fields shimmering under a white sun. At night, fog rolled off the river, softening everything, muffling sound. Overseers claimed the fog made it easier to move stock unseen. Slaves called it ghost breath, a shroud that came each night to hide what should never be witnessed. By the 1840s, the Caldwells estates formed a triangle across the South, linked by bloodlines and trade routes. Letters between family members mentioned shipments, rotations, and transfers. The same words used for cotton were used for children. When the war finally came, it was not morality that threatened them, but economics. The Emancipation Proclamation endangered everything they'd built, but even in collapse, the system clung to life. Riverbend, the last Caldwell estate, continued operations until 1880, 15 years after slavery's end, on the guise of contract labor. Births were still logged, the names still coded. The geography of the Caldwell Empire was more than physical, it was spiritual. Every plantation, Every town around it shared in the same quiet complicity. They had built not just farms, but a philosophy, a belief that order justified anything, that prosperity excused cruelty, that a God who blessed their crops must surely bless their crimes. And that is where the story truly begins, not in the courthouse where the ledgers were found, but in the landscape itself, in the towns that prayed beneath steeples built from the profits of human lives, in the soil that swallowed names faster than it grew cotton, in the air that still carries the weight of what was done there. History often tries to give evil a single face, one name to blame. But the Caldwell legacy wasn't built by one man's cruelty. It was engineered across bloodlines, refined like inheritance. Each generation accepted the work of the last, polishing it, perfecting it, and calling it order. The founder, Thomas Caldwell was born in 1754, a soldier who fought for independence and then returned to build his fortune from bondage. His neighbors called him a man of restraint, steady and devout. He carried a Bible in one hand and a ledger in the other. Those who worked for him said he rarely raised his voice. But when he spoke of the people he owned, he used the same tone he used for weather or soil, an element to be managed. He believed, sincerely, that slavery was not sin but stewardship. The Lord blesses a faithful through multiplication, he once wrote in his diary. He that tendeth the flock tendeth the will of heaven. His flock numbered 32 souls when he died. By the time his son Charles inherited the property in 1799, that number had doubled. Charles was not a soldier. He was a businessman, a man who believed that the future belonged to those who could turn faith into efficiency. His letters to other planters talk of improving domestic generations. In one, he wrote, "We breed our animals for endurance. Should we not also breed our servants for vigor?" There is no trace of irony in the sentence. Under Charles's management, the plantation shifted from a farm to an enterprise. He kept meticulous records, weights, heights, lineage. He created incentives for overseers to maximize return by increasing births. He never referred to what he was doing as breeding. He called it continuity. His wife, Margaret, helped maintain that illusion. Her diaries, discovered later among family effects, are filled with prayers and household notes. Between lists of linens and scripture quotes, small entries appear in the margins. Sarah recovered from delivery. Hannah to return to work after nursing. New beds needed for the nursery house. The handwriting is delicate, the language gentle. There is no blood in the words, no cruelty, only routine. And that is what makes them so horrifying. When Charles died in 1826, his son, Thomas II, inherited not only the estate, but the method. He was known for his charm, his philanthropy, his interest in agricultural science. He read about livestock breeding techniques and applied them to his house stock. He developed what he called rotation schedules, pairing men and women based on strength and fertility. Every birth was recorded as a success. Every miscarriage, a loss of investment. He wrote to a cousin in Georgia, "Our greatest profit lies not in the field, but in the cradle." Thomas II attended church every Sunday. He donated hymnals. He never spoke of cruelty. He didn't have to. His cruelty was administrative. By the time his son, Thomas Caldwell III, took control in the 1840s, the practice was institutionalized. The plantation at Briar Hollow had grown into a machine. Visitors described the house as elegant. White columns, manicured lawns, servants in uniforms. They called it civilization carved from wilderness. None of them saw the backfields, the sheds beyond the magnolias, or the sound that carried to the trees at night, the rhythmic cries of women giving birth to their owners' investments. Thomas III was different from his predecessors. He was educated, sophisticated, and convinced that his system was humane. He hired doctors, midwives, and accountants. He made records so precise that later historians would compare them to census data. The ledgers from his era are almost beautiful in their consistency. Column after column, neatly labeled. Name, age, status, conception, delivery, value. His wife, Eleanor, became the matriarch of respectability. She hosted charity luncheons, taught Sunday school, and wrote letters filled with scripture. Yet her private journal contains a single line that erases all pretense of ignorance. The nursery thrives this season. The Lord provides abundantly. By then, the Caldwells owned more than 400 people. Many were their own blood. The resemblance between master and slave was so striking that visitors sometimes commented on it. Eleanor once wrote, "We must begin to sell those who bear the Caldwell look, lest confusion arise among guests." The family portrait from that era, still hanging in a small museum in Alabama, shows them seated together on the veranda. Thomas III in his suit, Eleanor beside him, their children arranged in perfect symmetry. The artist captured light filtering through the trees, gold against white fabric. In the background, almost invisible unless you look closely, a dark figure carries a bundle down the path. The museum placard identifies her as a servant bringing linens. But if you zoom in, you can see what's really in her arms. It's a child, and on the child's ankle, barely visible in paint faded by time, is a small iron tag. When the Civil War came, Thomas IV, born into wealth, raised on ledgers and prayer, fought for Confederacy. He lost everything but the land. When the war ended, he returned to Riverbend and rewrote the same system under new names: contracts, shares, apprenticeships. The people who had once been recorded as property now signed papers that bound them to the same soil, the same house, the same ghosts. By the time he died in 1880, he had kept the tradition unbroken for nearly a century. For generations, each claiming virtue, each improving the system. A dynasty of conscience without conscience. That is the true horror of the Caldwells. Not the whip, not the chains, but the faith, the unwavering belief that they were good. And that belief, refined, documented, and passed down, was far more durable than any plantation house. The Caldwell system was never born out of chaos. It was methodical, its cruelty disguised as administration, its horror hidden beneath the calm of ledgers and polite conversation. To read the records now is to step into the mind of a bureaucracy, so complete it made atrocity look like agriculture. At its height, the family divided their operations into 4 divisions: acquisition, pairing, production, and distribution. The language was agricultural, but the subjects were human. The entire structure was built to ensure one thing: that every womb on Caldwell land produced capital. Acquisition began in Virginia, when Thomas Caldwell II realized that transporting slaves from Africa was no longer legal or cost-effective. Instead, he began purchasing women from nearby estates, chosen for what he called breeding promise. These selections were not random. The ledgers list height, weight, skin tone, and what they called line reliability, a grotesque term meaning fertility proven through multiple births. By the 1820s, Caldwell's overseers were visiting neighboring plantations to borrow men for planned unions, often trading labor or small goods in return. Each pairing was recorded, timed, and followed up with medical notes. When a woman conceived, her diet was adjusted. When she gave birth, her recovery was timed. The nursery at Briar Hollow was the heart of the system. It stood at the far edge of the property, out of view of the main house, but close enough for supervision. It consisted of 6 cabins arranged in a crescent around a larger central structure that functioned as both birthing room and infirmary. The walls were lined with shelves of ledgers, bottles, and hand tools, evidence that this was not a place of care, but of measurement. Overseers referred to the enslaved women as mothers and producers. When one died in childbirth, the report was filed under loss of assets. In an 1844 ledger, an overseer named Nathaniel Cobb wrote, "Recommend replacement from green property, yield dropping below projection." Even the deaths had margins. The Caldwells treated births like harvests. At the end of every quarter, a summary was sent to the main office, the house study. Thomas II signed off each report personally. The entries are mechanical. Quarter ending June 1843, 12 births, 2 miscarriages, 1 maternal death. Total valuation, $3,275. Under his signature are 2 faint ink blots, like fingerprints. The pairing process was just as systemized. Men and women were matched according to physical attributes, endurance, and temperament. Overseers kept notes on compatibility, referring to certain pairings as productive lines. In one surviving ledger, two names, Isaac and Dinah, appear together 14 times. Each entry lists a child. Each child is marked retained for house use. If a woman failed to conceive after multiple cycles, she was labeled barren and reassigned to field labor. The system had no room for the unprofitable. Overseers who maintained high production rates were rewarded with bonuses, paid in cash or land. The family's accountant, Lemuel Graves, recorded these payments without commentary, placing human life beside seed costs and mule purchases as if they were interchangeable columns. What made the system sustainable was the illusion of benevolence. The Caldwells built small chapels on their land, encouraging attendance. They baptized the children born into bondage, gave them biblical names, and held annual feasts where overseers prayed for another fruitful season. Visitors mistook this for kindness, but the prayers were numbers spoken aloud. The law was their shield. Under partis sequitur ventrem, a child inherited the mother's enslaved status, ensuring that every birth increased ownership. Each new life wasn't a person. It was property that replenished itself. The family's wealth multiplied geometrically. Even the medical staff were complicit. Dr. Amos Latimer, hired in 1842, kept a diary filled with cold clinical notes, administered laudanum to ease contractions, adjusted diet of wet nurses, repaired perineal tears with sutures, recommend rest period of 3 weeks before next conception. He was paid $12 a month and wrote that his employer treats the stock with unusual consideration. The phrase appears often, unusual consideration. It was how outsiders justified their silence. Everyone knew something about the Caldwells, but they admired their discipline, their philanthropy, their good manners. The plantation was quiet, clean, efficient. Evil rarely looks like chaos. It looks like order without empathy. What set the Caldwells apart was their obsession with record-keeping. Every transaction was documented, every death assigned a cause. Their papers read like the minutes of a corporation. There are entries labeled projected yield deficits and optimization recommendations. By 1856, they were insuring their stock through banks in Mobile and New Orleans. The same institutions that funded churches also underwrote human breeding. In the surviving correspondence between Thomas III and his cousin in Georgia, one line stands out. If Providence allows us to create life, it would be ungrateful not to profit by it. That single sentence explains everything. By the eve of the Civil War, Caldwell Properties collectively held over 400 enslaved people, with 600 recorded births across 3 generations. Their ledgers calculated mortality, fertility, and sale value down to the dollar. It was an empire without guns, sustained by the womb and the pen. The surrounding community benefited, too. Merchants supplied cloth for infant wrappings. Midwives were contracted under the table. Ministers blessed the fruitful house of Caldwell from their pulpits, quoting scripture about inheritance. The entire county became part of the mechanism, each piece clicking neatly into place. This wasn't a secret kept by fear. It was a secret kept by convenience. Everyone was profiting, directly or indirectly. And once profit becomes shared, morality becomes negotiable. After decades of repetition, the system no longer shocked even those within it. It became nature. The births, the baptisms, the sales, it all moved with the rhythm of the seasons. The records stopped using words like child or woman. By the 1850s, the ledgers refer only to units. Somewhere in those pages, a line blurs, the moment when exploitation turned to extinction of empathy. No one noticed when it happened. That's the genius of bureaucracy. It erases the need for intent. The Caldwells didn't just own people. They owned process. And by perfecting that process, they taught the South a quiet lesson: how to commit horror politely. By 1860, the fields of Briar Hollow shimmered under a sun that seemed unwilling to set. Cotton hung thick and heavy, the plants white and swollen, the air dense with the sweetness of rot. Inside the main house, Thomas Caldwell III sat by the window, scratching against paper. The entry that day was simple: 12 new births, prices expected to hold through autumn. He did not know that within 5 years, those numbers would mean nothing. The war came slow, then all at once. Rumors reached Alabama first as whispers. Federal troops moving south, Richmond fallen. Slaves rising in Tennessee. For the first time in generations, the Caldwells faced something they could not calculate: uncertainty. The ledgers reflect it. After 1862, the handwriting changes. The margins grow crowded. Notes appear in a different ink, more hurried. Transfer nursery to Riverbend. Briar Hollow unsafe. Sell 2 lots before harvest. The Confederate cause gave them purpose, at least on paper. Thomas IV, barely 20, enlisted, while his father remained home, guarding what he called our inheritance. Riverbend became both refuge and prison. The family moved the women and children there by wagon, traveling only at night. The journey took 2 weeks. Some never arrived. The ledger marks their absence coldly. Loss in transport. Union soldiers would later describe Riverbend as a plantation fortified by silence. The gates were chained, the fields unworked, the air thick with the smell of smoke and sickness. Inside the nursery cabins, births continued. Even in war, the system persisted. The overseers recorded deliveries while cannon fire echoed miles away. The same rituals, the same signatures. Profit had turned to survival instinct. But something was changing in the air. Enslaved men who had been forced into Confederate labor battalions began returning, armed and restless. In late 1863, 2 runaways from Riverbend reached Union lines and gave testimony to an officer named Captain James O'Hara. His report survives in the National Archives. The Caldwell place is no farm but a factory of children. The women say their owners breed them like horses. There are records, they say, locked in the big house safe. The report was filed and ignored. By then, the Union had larger wars to fight. But O'Hara's notes would later guide the soldiers who finally reached Riverbend in the spring of 1865. The diary of Private Samuel Vickers, one of those soldiers, describes what they found. The house stood empty, but the yard was full of children. Dozens of them, some crying, some silent, all barefoot. They called themselves Caldwell. The nursery cabins had been abandoned in haste. The ledgers left open on the table, ink still wet. On one page, the final entry reads, 7 born this month, future uncertain. Beneath it, the quill had carved a deep scratch, as though the writer's hand had trembled. The soldiers freed everyone they could find, but freedom is not a spell. The world does not erase itself overnight. The women stayed because they had nowhere to go. The children stayed because they did not understand what freedom meant. The Caldwells fled west, leaving behind their name, their land, and their ghosts. For a while, it seemed the horror had ended, but greed does not vanish. It adapts. Within 2 years, Thomas Caldwell returned under the banner of Reconstruction Enterprise. He reopened Riverbend under a new system, sharecropping. Contracts replaced chains. Freed families signed with trembling hands, promising a portion of their harvest in exchange for seed and tools. On paper, it looked like partnership. In truth, it was the same bondage written in a new dialect. The children who had once been cataloged as units now signed their names to debts they could never repay. The ledgers resumed, new covers, new titles, same ink. Where value once appeared, the word balance took its place. When Thomas IV died in 1880, his final account book still listed dozens of families under Caldwell tenancy. He never called it slavery. He called it tradition. The plantations decayed, but the lineage endured. The families scattered into cities: Mobile, Atlanta, New Orleans. Some became lawyers, bankers, politicians. The name Caldwell appeared on trust funds and college endowments. Each generation polished it cleaner. No one asked where the wealth began. No one opened the basement boxes. For the descendants of those born in the nursery, the story moved differently. Some stayed on the land, bound by poverty and fear. Others drifted north during the Great Migration, carrying little more than a surname that linked them to men who had owned their ancestors' bodies. That's how the past hides itself. It changes form but keeps the name. A century later, in the 1970s, whispers resurfaced in the small towns of Greene and Jefferson counties. Elders spoke of a baby farm, a cursed plantation where the ground refused to grow straight. Church mothers warned their children not to play near the old river path, saying the soil there was heavy with memory. When the courthouse renovation in 1987 unearthed the ledgers, those whispers became proof. The chest was not just metal and paper. It was the conscience of a region, exhumed. But instead of confession, the discovery brought panic. Officials sealed the records again, fearing lawsuits, outrage, and shame. The Caldwell's living descendants funded the courthouse restoration that buried them a second time. Even now, Riverbend remains private property. The land has changed hands many times, but locals say it feels wrong, like standing in a room that remembers pain. Hunters claim to hear crying near the grove where the nursery once stood. After storms, bones sometimes surface in the soil, small, brittle, impossible to trace. They are gathered quietly and reburied by county workers. No records kept. The horror of the Caldwells was not that they were monsters. It was that they were ordinary, churchgoers, landowners, family men, the kind of people who shook hands and said grace before dinner. They did not think they were evil. They thought they were efficient. That is how atrocity survives. Not in the heat of cruelty, but in the coolness of routine. In the decades that followed the war, the Caldwell name reshaped itself into something respectable. The families split across states, reinventing their story. In Alabama, they became bankers. In Virginia, they turned to politics. By the early 20th century, they had washed their hands clean in public memory, their descendants sponsoring church renovations, scholarships, and local fairs. The name Caldwell appeared on library plaques and courthouse wings. No one questioned the money. No one mentioned the ledgers. Then, nearly a century later, the truth began to surface again, not because anyone sought justice, but because of an archivist's curiosity. In 1987, when county contractors tore up the courthouse floors, the chest emerged like something the earth had decided it would no longer keep buried. Inside that chest were the 22 ledgers we now know as the Caldwell records. It took just 3 days for the discovery to reach the local paper, and only 2 more for the story to vanish from it. The chest was reclassified as estate property and sealed under a new lock. It would have stayed that way if not for a woman named Evelyn Turner. Turner was 32, a graduate student at the University of Alabama, soft-spoken, persistent, and far too young to understand how dangerous history could be when it's true. She had been researching the economics of Reconstruction when she came across a one-line note in a microfilm index. Caldwell Estate, birth ledgers confidential. She filed a request. 2 weeks later, she was escorted into a basement room where a single book awaited her on a wooden table. The clerk who handed it over told her quietly, "Don't read that too long." The book's first page was dated 1821. It began with the names of 30 women, each followed by a series of initials and numbers. It took Turner less than 5 minutes to understand what she was looking at. These were not labor records. These were genealogies of ownership, names written by people who had mistaken possession for providence. She spent 2 years piecing together what remained. Court filings, church baptisms, sale receipts. Every source led back to the same family. By 1990, she had written a paper documenting the system in detail, how the Caldwells had maintained a self-sustaining labor force to control reproduction for nearly a century, producing over 800 enslaved children, and how those children's descendants still lived unknowingly on the same soil. Turner presented her findings at a historical conference in Birmingham. The audience listened in silence. Then an older man rose, a lawyer and benefactor whose family name appeared repeatedly in her sources. His face was pale. "You will destroy people's lives with this," he said. "Do you understand that?" Within a month, her research grant was revoked. Anonymous calls flooded her home. She was accused of forging data, of sensationalism, of trying to rewrite history for attention. The university withdrew its support. She left academia and disappeared from public view. Years later, a librarian cleaning the archive room found her thesis among discarded papers. On the inside cover, written in pencil, was a single line: "If we bury the truth, it will learn to dig." She was right. In 2003, A team of genealogists studying DNA clusters among African-American families in Alabama found a recurring genetic marker linking dozens of lineages to a single white ancestor from the 18th century, a man named Thomas Caldwell. The data matched the pattern in the ledgers. Historians realized what that meant. The bloodline had continued, intertwining across color lines, generations, and social classes. The descendants of the enslaved and the enslavers were now the same people. When the finding made the news, reporters contacted Caldwell descendants still living in the South. Some refused comment. Others expressed shock, confusion, or denial. One woman said, "My grandfather told me our family raised workers, not slaves." Another said, "That was a long time ago. It's not who we are now." But silence is never neutral. Every institution that refused to confront those ledgers, every county clerk who sealed the chest, every historian who turned away, helped the Caldwell system survive in another form. The breeding program became history's ghost story, unspoken but present everywhere. A few years ago, a preservation group was granted limited access to Riverbend, the last standing Caldwell property. Most of it is overgrown now. The main house collapsed decades ago, the roof caved in under its own rot, but the soil beneath still remembers. During an excavation, workers uncovered a foundation of brick and stone, 6 small rectangles in a semicircle. Beneath them lay fragments, rusted chains, broken glass, a child's spoon, and something else, a small iron tag stamped with 3 letters, C6. In the ledgers, that code corresponds to a child born in 1846. Clara, age 7, light complexion, daughter of Dinah. Beside her name is a notation in the margin, written in a different hand. Sold. 1853, not retained. Clara's descendants are alive today. They carry her face without knowing her name. The discovery of that tag reignited the debate over what to do with the Caldwell estate. Some wanted to build a memorial. Others argued it was best left alone. No good comes from stirring the dead, one local official said. But the dead, it seems, have already stirred themselves. Residents report that after heavy rain, the ground along the old nursery line pools with water in perfect rows. 6 puddles, evenly spaced, like the foundations of the cabins that once stood there. Every time it rains, the same shapes return. Locals call them the ledgers in the earth. It's easy to dismiss those stories. Easier still to believe that the past can't reach us. But the truth is simpler. The past never went anywhere. It lives in our names, our laws, our families. The Caldwell system didn't end when the war did. It ended when we stopped looking away. If you ever visit Greene County, you can still find the courthouse where the chest was found. It's open to the public now. The building smells of dust and varnish, and the light slants into narrow windows like blades. In the basement, you'll find a door marked restricted access. Behind that door, sealed in climate control cases, rest the Caldwell ledgers. 22 volumes, 97 years, 814 lives. Each page a confession written in ink and denial. Each line proof that the most dangerous evil is not the kind we recognize, but the kind we rationalize. The ledgers sit silent now. They rest beneath glass, their ink brown by age, their pages too fragile to touch. Visitors stare down at them and whisper, as if the words might still hear. Some say it feels colder near the display, that the air itself tightens. Others say that's imagination. Maybe it is. Maybe it's just the weight of finally being seen. What the Caldwells did was not unique. Their sin was not invention. It was execution. They built a system so cleanly efficient that it outlived its language. They wrote their crimes as accountancy. And when the nation changed its laws, those ledgers quietly changed headings. Value became balance. Ownership became contract. And the same hands kept signing. You can trace their logic forward through time. After the breeding fields came the sharecropper contracts. After the sharecroppers, the convict lease programs. After the chains, the debt. Always another ledger. Always another line that turns a life into a number. The handwriting changes, but the arithmetic doesn't. That is a true horror. Not the blood, not the violence, but the comfort. The way evil wears order like perfume. The way entire towns learn to look away. The way piety and profit clasp hands and call it providence. When people talk about the past, they use distance as a shield. That was then. They were different. We know better now. But the truth is simpler and harder. The Caldwells did what they did because it was legal, because it was profitable, because their neighbors admired their discipline. And every age invents its own version of that same applause. Maybe that's why the soil never settles at Riverbend. Maybe that's why the courthouse floor keeps sinking, boards warping no matter how often they're replaced. Wood remembers. Earth remembers. Somewhere, beneath every American town, there are ledgers still whispering. If you ever stand on that ground after rain, look down. Watch how the puddles line up, how the water collects in perfect rectangles where the nursery once stood. That's history refusing to dry. The Caldwells are gone, but their arithmetic isn't. You can find in the balance sheets of prisons, in the neighborhoods divided by old survey lines, in the ways certain last names still open doors while others close them. The plantation is gone, but the structure remains, invisible, familiar, alive. When Evelyn Turner wrote her last note, "If we bury the truth, it will learn to dig," she wasn't warning us about ghosts. She was talking about systems, about how the ledgers always find a way back to the surface. And maybe that's why stories like this matter. Because remembrance is a kind of rebellion. Because to read what they wrote is to make them answer for it, one line at a time. If you've listened this far, take a breath. Think about your own town, your own courthouse, your own family's name carved into the side of a building. Ask yourself what kind of arithmetic built it. The past doesn't ask for forgiveness. It asks for witnesses. Now you've read the ledger. And once you've read it, you're part of it.